All right, folks, I'm really happy to be here today. Today I'm going to chat with you about creating great developer experiences in terms of how this can apply to APIs. And will this work the first time? Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I'm Matt Tanner. I'm the head of developer relations at Moesif. We are an API analytics and monetization company, and I generally tend to focus on API-first strategy, monetization, and product-led growth. My background is a mix of enterprise knowledge and a love for startups. So for the last 3 years, I've been working with various startups and working with them to essentially create better developer experiences through developer relations. Through this, I've learned a lot of things about how developers interact with different platforms, especially APIs. So when we usually think of metrics, we think about web metrics. And those look at things like average read time, stuff like page views, session time, video plays, and comments. These are great for front-end applications. However, for APIs, they're not overly applicable. So for APIs, what I suggest is that we take a different approach to this and maybe simplify it a little bit. What we want to look at with APIs is a developer experience should go beyond those page views and vanity metrics. What we want to look at is something like adoption. We want to look at engagement and usage. We want to look at retention. So for adoption, this is how many people are coming on board onto our APIs? How quickly are we onboarding folks to using them? Are we bringing them in? Engagement and usage, I think, is very core as well. So when we talk about, maybe we've sold our APIs to customers. So that covers the adoption portion of it. However, if they're not using them, then there really is no point for them to continue to use those APIs. And that's where we get into this third piece, which is retention. If people have adopted our APIs, then are using those APIs, we want to figure out how long they're using those APIs for and how we're retaining them. So when we look at those types of things, we can kind of distill it down to, if we want to improve each of those metric areas, we can look at these 4 things that great developer experiences share. The first one, and I think many of us, especially if you've worked in a startup before, really have to look at this, which is product functionality truly solves a problem. If you've created an API that really is only proprietary to you and can't be used by anybody else, well, it solves a problem for you, but not other folks. If you've created something that's widely applicable, then you're going to start to see that adoption, you'll see that engagement, and you'll hopefully see that retention. One area that I tend to focus on as a developer relations person is great documentation and tutorials. So we've all done it where we've went to use an API, and you go to the documentation that hopefully exists. But if it doesn't exist, if it does exist and it's terrible, it might as well not be there in the first place. So we want to make sure that we improve that. We also want to make sure that our API is easy to integrate with. And I also put onboarding there because sometimes when we have an API and it's hard to get access to, well, that's a bad developer experience. And lastly, and probably most importantly, especially when I chat with a lot of these other users, is like, hey, you got a great API, you got great documentation, super easy to integrate, but man, that service is not stable and the uptime is like terrible. So you want to make sure that it's stable and scalable. So you have all those things that you can kind of take into consideration. I just want to keep an eye on the time here. You can take into consideration, but you really want to be able to measure this stuff. So you want to be able to identify gaps in developer experiences through metrics. So what we tend to do is when we think of APIs, we build them and we publish them, people use them, but we don't really think about, well, what kind of metrics could I gather on this? How are developers experiencing this? Is there a lot of outages? Are they integrating easily? Is the onboarding easy? These types of things. In order to do this, you need to start looking at stuff like the end-to-end journey of that API usage. So you're going to look at something like what we have here, which is the end-to-end journey of how someone uses, let's just say, a single API. First, you might have 100% of people visit your page, because let's say you have, in order to get access to your API, you have a public website. They come to that page. Then we see that 60% after 10 minutes then sign up. With metrics, we can measure that. If you're not measuring this, there's nothing that you can really improve because you don't know. Then the next step that we have here, they've signed up, and then we see that after 6 hours, 30% get to their first API call or their first hello world. Now, I really want to point this out because all of us say that our APIs are easy to use, but if you start seeing people signing up and it takes them 6 hours to make their first API call, it's probably not that easy to use. Again, if you're not tracking it, you're not able to tell that. You can ask your customers how easy it is, and usually they'll be nice and say, oh, it was really easy to onboard. It just took us 6 hours of work. And then here's the part that most of us are concerned about, especially if we're monetizing our APIs, which is realized value. This is where they've adopted it, they've done their first API call, they know how to use it, and now they're repeatedly using it, which is how we can start to generate money and revenue from those APIs. That's why we put the money bag there. Now, this is a screenshot from our tool, Moesif, but it really displays kind of how you can look at things. So what I have in the first part here is very similar to what I showed in the last slide, where we have a user action, which is a sign up on the website. Then we can see here the conversion rate, so how many people, after they've signed up, call our, let's say it's a fintech API, call our /payment API. We can see that 50% of folks are converting to using it. And then here, we can see that continue to use it more than 100 times, so that's someone who's fully adopted our product. That is only 35%. Why is this important to track this? Well, our businesses are profitable and sustainable because of the amount of people who are using our APIs. Let's say we go, okay, from sign up to first API call here, why are only 49% of folks doing this? Maybe what happens is 25% of those folks on their first few calls receive a 500 error. If they continue to do that, they're probably not going to continue to adopt our API. So therefore, they stop at that first API call. A more common one that I find is that in our API docs, we talk about how to use our API, how to use the authorization. Maybe we attach an authorization header or something like that. But not everybody uses it correctly. So therefore, right here, what we might do is we might actually look at how many of those folks are experiencing a 401 error and then not continuing to use that API. And the last part is, how do we get more people to use our API religiously? Now, you can look at the high-level metrics like that, or you can divide it down just a little bit further, where you might want to look at how people are using your API. So this is an example here of an API called, let's just a generic API that we would have, but we're able to see based on the payload that's returned, what API calls they're making, and what data they're getting back from those API calls, and how that's segmented by company. Why is that important? Well, what you might find is that maybe you have one customer that's paying you a lot of money, and you have one customer that's paying you a little bit of money. The value to your company is going to be much bigger for the company that's paying you more. Therefore, you might want to look at their metrics separately than the company that's bringing in a little bit less. So how do you measure engagement then? So that was kind of the main thing that we want to make sure. We've created an API, they've adopted the API. How do we actually make sure that people are using our API? A bad way of doing that would be API calls. It's very generic. We can't get much out of it. So, I'm a user. How many API calls have I made? It's a great way to tell that we're getting some traction, but we don't know exactly. A better way of doing that is weekly active tokens. So we're able to see something like, how many API keys is this company using per week? But the best way to do this is to do it by weekly active users. Because now we can see that, okay, the company is making billions of API calls per month, and this is coming from an equally high amount of users. Or what you might find is that you have a ton of API calls coming from a single user. If that single user leaves that company, they may take their business with them. So it's important for us to know how many weekly active users are using the platform. And once we know that, trying to engage more folks to use the platform. If it's only one, get the customer success team on to try and figure out why more people aren't using it. So what we can do is, metrics are one thing, and I always say this when I'm chatting with customers, that metrics are one thing. They give us a great story. Okay, I've got a chart, but a lot of people ask, well, what do I do with it? This is where we want to start looking at automation, and I'm a true believer in this. Our company runs very lean, and we use a lot of these principles internally. So what you want to start doing is looking at, how can I automate some of these steps to improve the developer experience? And I put exponentially because it's absolutely crazy how, if you get the automation in place, it usually doesn't matter how many customers you have of your API because it's automated. So it's very scalable. So the first one is using emails and in-app notifications to guide users. A lot of us, people come onto our API, they use it, and we don't really have any interaction with them. We might talk to the customer success team, something like that. However, wouldn't it be great if the next time you use an API and you get, let's say you get an authorization error, the API can detect that, or the system that the API is running through can detect that, and send you an email or an in-app notification if you have some type of developer portal and say, hey, you attached the wrong token, here's a guide on how to do it correctly. Now not only will they not have to reach out to your customer success team, but they will also be able to do it themselves more quickly, because most of us developers aren't going to reach out to a customer success team if we have issue with a API. The next thing that kind of comes from the PLG strategy, so product-led growth, is create rules that stop users from going off track. So make the API easy to use. From a governance perspective, what you might do is you might enforce it so that, let's say you have 3 different ways to authenticate with your API. Don't do that. Just do one. And if they try to use another type of authentication, push them back to using the one authentication mechanism that's easy to use. The third part is more about internal teams, so the teams behind the APIs. Inform customer success teams about customer issues. So if a customer is receiving a bunch of 500 errors because the server's down, don't let the customer reach out to you about it. Have it automatically go to your customer success team, and then the customer success team can engage engineering to make sure that service is back up, and eventually also be able to reach out to the customer to make sure that they can handle it too. And the last part is a welcome email flow to drive home your value. If they call the API the first time, then send them something that says, hey, you're using this API, here's 3 more APIs that might be beneficial to you. This is going to get that adoption and engagement and hopefully retention a lot higher. So to sum up very quickly, how I would do this and how I recommend a lot of our users do this is use emails to guide developers. Don't set them on the API, and that's it. If they're on your platform, make sure that you're corresponding with them through email as well. If you have some type of developer portal, which most of us do for our APIs, make sure that you're doing in-app notifications. If something's wrong or the API is down, let them know. Be proactive. You're able to do this. So take more of a product-led growth approach to how you're introducing these APIs. And lastly, I think this is the last one, is try to make it so that users can't misuse or abuse your APIs. And this is the last thing that I mentioned, is automatically alert your customer success team when certain conditions are met. If there's something going wrong, don't let the API user reach out to you. Let your customer success team know. And with that, that concludes my presentation. And yes, thank you so much for joining this talk on developer experience.